It's good to be in the pulpit today. I enjoyed last week's question box service. Always grateful to get a sense of your spiritual quests and institutional concerns. And it's fun to have a little bit of time for something slightly more spontaneous. But I'm also appreciative of the opportunity to have a more traditional service this Sunday. Ralph Waldo Emerson once advised aspiring preachers that the true preacher deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. Preparing and delivering sermons is part of my spiritual practice. The opportunity to reflect in conversation with the community and a tradition upon what Emerson called the age of the world, the state of our congregation, and how goes it with my soul, in the hopes that I might stir something within yours. Emerson's gendered language, though, is thoroughly out of date in a contemporary Unitarian Universalist pulpit, though not, I fear, a Southern Baptist one. And what seems to be a strangely unbiblical move, the Southern Baptist Convention, as you probably know, recently voted to expel 2 congregations with female leaders and limit all pastoral and ministerial roles to men. Paul, the apostle, would have been shocked. Read through his letters in the Christian New Testament, and you'll find him constantly and praising and encouraging women's leadership. In his letter to the Romans alone, we find him praising the ministry of Phoebe and recommending that the congregation in Rome support her in any business in which she may need your help, sending greetings to Prisca, Aquila, Mary, who worked so hard for you, Junia, eminent amongst the apostles, Patrobas, Julia, and Olympus, almost a dozen women leaders in all. He probably would have been significantly less surprised to learn that we Unitarian Universalists have been ordaining women since the middle of the 19th century. When Olympia Brown became a minister back in 1863, she was the first woman to be ordained with the consent of her denomination. For us, the thought that a woman could not lead a church is singularly strange. This June, after all, marked the election of the Reverend Dr. Sophia Bentoncourt as the president of our association. She's the second woman elected to that position and the first queer woman of African descent to lead a major denomination in the United States. A couple of weeks later, the United Church of Christ followed our suit when they elected the first black woman, the Reverend Karen Georgia Thompson, to the presidency of their denomination, making them the first major Christian denomination to be led by a woman of African descent. I mention all of this in part because the age of the world in which we live is one of increasing social fracture. Religious institutions are not immune to this dynamic. Entities like the Southern Baptist Convention seem to be more content to focus on conservatism than Christianity. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, after all, was written at the request of one of Chloe's people, Chloe being a female leader of that church. And when I read news of their internal deliberations, I cannot help but think of the political philosopher Corey Robin. He observed that conservatism is best understood as a meditation on the felt experience of having power, seeing it threatened, and trying to win it back. The dynamic, he noted, plays out as much in the private sphere as it does in the public one. And a key to understanding the rise of white working class conservatism is recognizing that the leadership of women, people of color, people of African descent, and others threatens, in their words, how a father governs his family. We Unitarian Universalists, of course, welcome all sorts of families and make no assumption that the family needs to be a patriarchal institution. Families can be matriarchies, queer, or follow other arrangements, be they connected by blood or formed by choice. I suspect that if you're here this morning, it's in part because you understand that love is love, and that any consenting adult relationship united by love deserves to be celebrated. I also know that some of you are with us this morning for the very reason that religious institutions like the Southern Baptist Convention will not celebrate the fullness of your gifts or the beauty of your relationships. And I suspect that you are also here with us because our Unitarian Universalist tradition demands that we do. That's why partially I suspect we have a growing congregation these days. Oftentimes in July and August, we have a lot of people who come church shopping, looking for a religious community to join. And this has especially been true as of late. The last several weeks, the sanctuary hasn't quite felt like a summer sanctuary. We've been having almost as many people here between the two services as we have had in autumn, typically have in autumn. A couple of Sundays in June and July, in fact, we've had even better attendance than we have had on Christmas Eve. Not today, sadly, but and in just this past 2 weeks, we've had 3 people join the congregation and another 20 people who are someplace in the membership process. And our growth hasn't only been numerical, we've been growing in diversity as well. During our most recent meetings, the Spanish language ministry team has welcomed new people and new community partners. The program seems likely to expand in exciting ways over the coming months. In my conversations with new members and visitors, it seems like a great number of you are just learning something about our faith tradition. Unitarian Universalism is, after all, not widespread in Texas. This is not Boston. You come seeking community, spiritual grounding, and an antidote to the politics of cruelty. You're also not exactly certain, oftentimes, what Unitarian Universalism is, so this morning seems like a good a time as any to offer a little bit of theological orientation. Certainly, the most important things to know are expressed in the first 2 phrases of our congregational covenant. Love is the spirit of our congregation. Service is our prayer. We seek to be a community of radical inclusion. We want to be a place where all are welcome to bring the fullness of themselves. We're devoted to building the world we dream about. It is a world filled with beauty in which all people, all being, can be nurtured and sustained, and the planet is not threatened by the climate catastrophe, where the politics of compassion rather than the politics of cruelty govern. Beyond that, there is our name, Unitarian Universalist. Today, our movement is non-creedal. We do not require our members to adhere to a statement of faith, such as those found in conventional Christian congregations, to join our community. Yet curiously, for a non-creedal tradition, the words Unitarian and Universalist are each tied to a specific religious doctrine. Unitarianism symbolizing a belief in the unity of God, and with that belief, the affirmation of the humanity of Jesus. Universalists indicated a trust in God's universal love to all creatures, as one of our early religious ancestors put it. More than 60 years ago, the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America joined forces to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. The historic theologies of the 2 traditions are neither identical nor fully compatible. Like all blended families, over the years, our congregations have had to make sense of their differing theological traditions and inheritances. One particular theological perspective on which our religious ancestors did not agree had to do with that uncomfortable word of salvation. The view of Universalists in the 19th and 18th centuries was summarized in an early article of faith as the belief that after death, God will finally restore the whole human race to happiness. Everyone, in other words, gets to go to heaven. You might recall Mark Morrison Reed's description of this historic vision. He's described how Universalism came to be called the gospel of God's success. Picturesquely spoken, the image was that of the last unrepentant sinner being dragged screaming and kicking into heaven, unable to resist the power and love of the Almighty. The last unrepentant sinner being dragged kicking and screaming into heaven. The Unitarians had a somewhat different view. They did not believe in universal salvation. Instead, they celebrated what William Ellery Channing called likeness to God. This was the understanding that each and every person was born with the divine spark within. The task of the religious community was to help us in uncovering that spark, tend to the flame, so that it might shine more and more brightly until eventually we might achieve what James Freeman Clarke, another 19th century Unitarian, named salvation by character. We can signify each approach to salvation with a single word: the gospel of God's success, being; salvation by character, becoming. Being and becoming. Both suggest a purpose for our religious communion, a way in which we are called to care for each other and nurture an alternative to the politics of cruelty. Being. The theologian Matthew Fox has described this perspective as a narrative around our births. Contrary to the Christian doctrine of original sin, which maintains we enter the world as blotches upon existence, Fox maintains we burst into the world as original blessings. I'm fairly certain that any of you who have had the privilege to give birth to a child or have been privileged to be present at a child's birth know this instinctually. We attest to it in our hymnal when we sing, "Each night a child is born is a holy night." Being. We aspire to be a community in which everyone is welcome. It is, as I said in our call to worship, which was drawn from the words of Susan Frederick Gray, if you are an immigrant or refugee, undocumented, you are welcome here. If you are Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Christian, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, a theist, or an atheist, you are welcome here. If you are gay or straight, a man or a woman, transgender or queer, you are welcome here. Whoever you are, you, your family, your whole self is welcome here. Being. Those of you who are, like me, over a certain age might remember this perspective summarized in the popular 70s children's song by Marlo Thomas. It promised, "You and me are free to be you and me." Free to be you and me. The most vivid description of a community devoted to the proposition of universal salvation I've run across is in Zora Neale Hurston's brief text, Mother Catherine. As Scott noted, Hurston was a pivotal literary figure in the first half of the 20th century. A leading light of the Harlem Renaissance, she trained as an anthropologist, and a number of her works observed black religion in the South and in the Caribbean. Mother Catherine was one of those. It describes the Church of Mother Catherine Seal, a spiritual leader in New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward, who held a Universalist theology. Completely unconnected to our movement, Hurston's descriptions of Mother Catherine's religious community offers a picture of Universalist heaven. Not only are all kinds of children welcome, but all being is held up as a blessing. Worship is not just a matter of human praise and exuberance. There are canary birds singing and chirping happily, a donkey, a mother goat with her kid, numbers of hens, a sheep, 2 dogs. I'm not sure who could handle such an environment. Probably not us. But Mother Catherine created one because God got all kinds. How come I can't love all of mine? Being here is where the Unitarian objections might come in. Yes, you are an original blessing. Yes, you are welcome here. Yes, you and me are free to be you and me. Yes, love is the spirit of the congregation. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes to all of that. But it is not enough. Service is our prayer, and to read a little further down our covenant, to seek the truth. Becoming, everyone is welcome, but we have not already built the world we dream about. Each of us always has work to do to become a better person. Religion should be about transformation, helping each of us uncover the spark of the divine, the highest potential that resides within. And here I fear we struggle. In our efforts to build an inclusive community, we expect sometimes people to arrive already at the point where they are recognizing everyone as original blessing. We want white folks like me to have already given up our frightful addiction to the poison of white supremacy. We want men to have already moved beyond toxic masculinity. We want straight people to fully accept transgender folks, even as they are just coming to understand that gender is fluid and, like race, a social construct. This, of course, comes with a paradox. If we're going to fully live into our vision of radical inclusion, then we have to have an environment where people who are not traditionally part of the white male dominant culture are safe from constant microaggressions and even real aggression. At a time of rising misogyny, we need to have women feel safe within our community. At a time when white supremacist and nativist movements are growing, people of color and immigrants need to know that this community is their community. At a time when LGBT communities are under assault, folks from those communities need to know that they are an original blessing. At a time of growing economic inequality, when union organizers are targeted and fired by corporations like Starbucks, working class people need to know that there are religious communities that support working class power. The challenge then is, how do we do it as a congregation? Hold these two things, being and becoming, in tension. I'm reminded of the account of a conversion experience that James Luther Adams, a great Unitarian theologian from the 20th century, offered in one of his essays. It's about a racial bigot. It seems that in the early 1950s, this man was trying to block the First Unitarian Church of Chicago, one of the few truly historic multiracial congregations in our tradition, from committing not just to racial integration, but active outreach to the city's African American community. He was on the board at the time, and after hours of arguing with his fellow board members, he finally came to the realization that the way forward for his congregation was through intentional outreach. And then he confessed, when asked why, he said, well, part of the purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. The purpose of the church is to get a hold of people like me and change them. I hesitate to imagine how much damage he did, how many micro and macro aggressions he committed to the members of the congregation who were people of color before he came to that realization. Being and becoming, the two visions of salvation are in tension. Perhaps it's simply like that line from Fyodor Dostoevsky, love and action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Playing the role of the preacher, I feel like I'm sometimes cast as a person with answers, but love and action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love and dreams. And I really just have questions, discomforts, and an urgent need to, though the road be rough and rocky, continue on a path of both being and becoming. Being and becoming. I'm not really sure how we do this thing that we try to do where we welcome everyone, confess that we have work to do, and somehow, some way, still have patience and compassion for each other. Some of what I know about it, like so much of what I know, though, comes not from church, but from my time in the labor movement. Now, I will confess that the story that I'm about to share may not connect entirely with congregational life, but it's one of those things that passes through the fire of my thought over and over again when I consider the challenge of nurturing a multiracial congregation. You see, congregations have a choice as to whether or not they want to be multiracial. Even today, 20 years into the 21st century, Sunday morning remains the most segregated hour of the week. Unions, however, do not have such a luxury. They have to be multiracial. If workers are going to come together and build power effectively against the powers and principalities of the hour, against the Howard Schultzes and Jeff Bezoses, against the massive wealth disparity that exists in our society, then they have to include everyone, because the workforce includes everyone. Well, about 20 years ago, I was involved in an effort to build a union in Chicago. And one of the first things you do when you're trying to start a union is you sit down and think about who are the leaders at the shop you're trying to organize or the industry you're trying to organize. Now, these leaders are not necessarily the people who hold positions of power. They're not necessarily the managers or the shift supervisors or the like. Instead, they're the folks who other people look up to and respect, and to some extent, yes, follow. If you can get those people, those leaders, to support the union, then the people who respect them will often join the effort. One of our tasks as organizers was to try and get different leaders to join the union. One day, the job fell to me to go and talk to someone who was known to have a particularly unpleasant personality. He was an older white guy who had a reputation for making disparaging remarks about just everyone who was not white or male. I was sent to talk to him because, well, as you can tell, I am white and male. We met in a rough bar on the west side, the kind where the floors are a bit sticky and your choices of a beverage are either a cheap beer or a cheap whiskey. And the first part of our conversation pretty much went exactly how you would expect it. He said about just about every sort of disgusting thing one could imagine. But finally, after listening to this barrage for probably about an hour, I was able to somehow turn the conversation to work. How is it at work? I asked him. What would you change if you could? How can a union help you make changes? Who needs to be in the union for you to make those changes? And then somehow, some way, that last question, that helped him to have a little bit of a light bulb go off. And I convinced him to join the union, and he went on to be one of our best organizers, going out and bringing in to the union all of those people who he had said such horrible things about. It was quite an experience of being and becoming, quite a learning about what happens when people are challenged to get outside of their comfort zones and both be and become. Because with him and many other leaders and folks in the union, those workers were able to cooperate together and within a year win the first wage gain that anyone in their industry, in their country, had won in more than a decade. And they were even able to form an LGBTQ caucus to address the needs of members of those communities at work. Being, becoming. I still have a lot of questions about that experience, but I suspect that somehow, some way, the path to building a multiracial congregation and a functioning multiracial democracy lies through moments like that. For it began with the recognition that somehow, some way, we're all in this together. We're all some sort of original blessing. But it also rested upon the acknowledgement that we each have work to do. We're not here perfectly formed. We're each challenged, if we want to build the world we dream about, to become better, to live in discomfort, and little by little uncover the spark within. That it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.